Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Ryan Spillers, Program Coordinator for the Alliance for Innovation, and I would like to welcome you all to today's virtual learning event, something us and our panel are calling Customizing Budget Engagement for Your Community Part 2. And if you were unable to join us for Part 1, do make sure to capture our follow-up email in the coming days, as I will link that recording in there for you all to access. So today's session is being brought to you by the Alliance for Innovation, Balancing Act, and the City of Norfolk, Virginia. During the next hour and continuing our presentation from Part 1, we will hear from our panelists about how they built a two-way relationship with residents on financial issues, and whether it's to identify priorities, set levels of service, gauge interest in changing revenue, build public understanding of long-term structural problems, prepare for an election, or get staff buy-in for change, or simply out of a commitment to good governance. So before I introduce and turn it over to our panelists and have them jump into their stories, let me first remind you all quickly about the Alliance and, our big goal here for today. It is through our incredible members, we aim to build sustainable, long-term, innovative cultures and help spread leading and emerging practices. Now, our hope here today is not just to have a great presentation, but to also hear from all of you to get your feedback, comments, and questions so that we can continue this conversation. One way that we would like to do that, as during the presentation, I will be live tweeting. So you can engage with us if you have a Twitter by connecting with us on #localgov, and be sure to tag us at TransformGov, as well as our friends here today at Balancing Act EP and at Norfolk VA. Now let's take a real quick look at GoToWebinar options for just a moment. As noted in the prior slide, we want to get your comments, feedback, and questions throughout today's session. And to do so, head on over to the highlighted yellow circle number 3. That's where you'll submit your questions. To get us those, just head on over to that questions box where you can type out your question for the panelists throughout today's session. Now, simply click on that plus sign. It should expand out and type out your question. Once you've hit submit, I'll get it on my end, and I'll be collecting those throughout today's webinar and be providing those to our moderator for the Q&A at the end of today's session. So send those in, your comments, feedback, questions at any time, and like I said, I'll be collecting those for the very end. All right, now for what you all tuned in for. Today's main presentation will be provided by Chris Adams, Megan Irwin, and Gregory Patrick. All right, so Chris has worked in public policy and facilitation for over 25 years. His work has focused primarily on health and healthcare, but he has also supported policy development in education and natural resources. Prior to founding Engage Public, Chris was a director and associate director of the Center for Ethics and Social Policy in Berkeley, California. He has published more than 40 essays and publications, including the Los Angeles Times, New York Newsday, the Christian Science Monitor, the San Francisco Chronicle, and many others. He is a past speaker at the Distinguished Conference on World Affairs at the University of Colorado, delivering 5 presentations on the theme Values and Ethics in a Fragile World. Adams is the former president of the board of Denver Urban Gardens, a network of more than 100 community gardens. He is also a graduate of Yale University and the University of Colorado. Also today, we'll be hearing from Gregory Patrick. And Greg joined the Office of Budget and Strategic Planning in March 2013 and has served as the budget director since 2017 in the city of Norfolk, Virginia. He holds a bachelor's degree in family financial management and a master's degree in accounting from Virginia Tech. Prior to joining the city of Norfolk, he provided business consulting and tax services at a public accounting firm specializing in CFO services for community action agencies. Greg also has extensive sales and operations management experience, having worked as a general manager most recently for CMH Homes. And also on the call with Greg is Megan Irwin, and she joined the City of Norfolk's Office of Budget and Strategic Planning as a budget and policy analyst in May 2017, where she had focused on community engagement in the budget process. Megan attended Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, where she earned a Master's of Public Affairs with concentrations in Public Financial Administration and Policy Analysis. During graduate school, Megan worked as a fellow with the Monroe County Council Office, where she developed cost estimates and fiscal impact statements for policy and program changes. Megan is the 2011 Harry S. Truman Scholar for Indiana and was the recipient of the 2017 GFOA Goldberg-Miller Public Finance Award. I would like to welcome Chris, Greg, and Megan to the session, and from here I will pass it on off to Chris. Uh-oh, Chris, it looks like you might be muted at the moment.
There we are. All right. How is that?
Perfect.
All right, good. So let me see here. Are you looking at my screen? Yes, you are. Okay, great. And I wish I could make myself a little smaller here. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, let's just look for this. All right. So once again, thank you to the Alliance for putting this on, and also to City of Norfolk. There's actually a connection there. We first started working with Virginia Beach through the Alliance. We met them several years ago there, and the current assistant city manager of Norfolk is Catherine Whiteville, and it's nice to go across the waterway there in Hampton Roads and work with Norfolk as well. This is actually it's a very exciting time in terms of budget engagement. There are a lot of conversations going on right now, both among cities and counties and even states about what's next with transparency. Right now, the GFOA Transparency Task Force is trying to assess what to do for North American cities, and especially in the U.S. and Canada, that have largely addressed the major hurdles in terms of transparency. I don't think I can think of a local government or a state government, certainly, where you can't get information on the budget, where you can't find the budget book or a CAFR. A number of local governments have gone a step beyond, and they use various types of visualization, and that's all terrific. But what I think the leaders in terms of thinking about what's next in terms of getting more value out of that transparency are considering participation to be the next thing that is really going to start happening, and I think going to become a more widespread thing. It's currently being done by a number of leading local governments, but I think that as we move forward in the very near future, that this will become a more and more common thing. And cities like Norfolk and Virginia Beach and San Antonio and places like that are really in the vanguard and offer some good lessons. And that's one reason why I'm so excited about today. So this slide here, what's the why? This is just why do budget engagement. And I've already talked about sort of the major reason for that is that this is just, it's the next step from transparency. It's a way of getting value from transparency. Currently, we have a number of governments that are doing it with no particular urgent issue that they need to educate the public about, but they're just doing it because they think it's good governance. I remember a very memorable quote from Catherine Whiteville. She was interviewed by, who's currently at City of Norfolk, who talked about her strong belief that as city staff, as local government staff, that they're stewards of the public money, and they've got a great obligation to ensure that they're spending in ways that reflect the priorities and needs of those who are paying taxes. And I think you very much find that. There's a lot of cities as well that are experiencing some real challenges, and they need to have a way to have a two-way conversation with residents about some important looming issues. Revenues falling, expenses going up, political pressures, structural issues, legacy infrastructure issues, pensions, and just a lot of reasons why this might be something that needs to be done. And I just gave a presentation about 2 weeks ago to GFOA, as I mentioned, and just sort of thinking about what's the what out there. So we just talked about what's the why, what's the what. You can do a lot of different things in terms of budget engagement. The most obvious one, and it's even legally mandated in a lot of areas, are public meetings. Those tend not to be very well attended or even very productive. We sometimes call those 3 minutes at the mic, if people even show up at those. As I mentioned, PDFs and financial reports, those are pretty much widely available everywhere. Some places are making checkbooks available where residents or really the public can just go in and search for transactions, and that can be sort of useful. One of the problems with that is it often misses context, but there's probably some ways around that. I mentioned earlier that there are visualizations. There are a number of purpose-made organizations that provide visualizations just for government, and they do a fantastic job to make data available and to visualize it. And there's also some other ways of using that through some different types of software that aren't necessarily made for government, but it can be actually fairly low cost. And then the two at the bottom that are in red, those are the two that my organization, Balancing Act, has been trying to make available in a sort of a high quality, affordable format, tax receipts, where we estimate someone's tax burden. We have some questions that we ask that allows us to estimate sales tax or property tax or income tax, or whatever revenue sources a local government might have, and then to give them a breakdown of how much they're paying. And that can be a very effective way of showing accountability to residents for how you're using their tax dollars. And then the next one is simulations, and that's what we're going to talk about most today. We'll talk a little bit about tax receipts and some other things as well. Now, this next slide, this is a screen grab from, or a snippet from an article that appeared in the Government Finance Review in March, and it was written by Mark Mack from GFOA and myself. And we're just sort of remarking over the last 30 years, researchers and practitioners who've tried this, who've looked into this issue, have understood that simulations are really the most powerful way of engaging residents in thinking through tough budget challenges and understanding items that are at stake, and getting some good informed input, or even going beyond just input and getting what economists call sincere preferences or willingness to pay. That this is an excellent way to do that. The problem was that previously they were very expensive, and they were done by hand, paper and pencil, a lot of staff time, limited number of participants. And what we've got now is we've got some cloud-based solutions that make this very easy to do in a high-quality way, both face-to-face and online, that can reach thousands and thousands of people for a remarkably small cost. And so that's why we're at this moment right now, when I think that this addition of participation to transparency is really at a point where it just makes sense, because currently a lot of local governments are not realizing the return on investment for their transparency efforts, and by adding participation to that, you actually get information back, and you get a much more dynamic relationship with residents. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Norfolk. All of you are lucky today to hear Norfolk's story. It got postponed last month because of Hurricane Florence, but they've just done an amazing job with taking all sorts of approaches to doing some excellent work in terms of budget engagement. So I'm looking very much forward to Megan and Greg's presentation.
Yeah. All right. Can you see our screen?
Yes.
Great.
So good afternoon, everyone. Megan and I are really excited to have the opportunity to share some of our experiences in budget engagement from over the course of the last year. We think it was a pretty successful year, and we appreciate you guys taking the interest and listening to our story. This morning, Megan and I were discussing how we were going to split up the presentation today, and Megan suggested that maybe I should talk about what we used to do, and let her talk about, the cool new stuff that we did. The good thing was I didn't take it at all that she was calling me a slightly old non-millennial who probably doesn't understand today's digital environment. So anyhow, we are going to start with how we used to do things. But before we get there, a little bit about why and our situation as we were entering budget development for fiscal year 2018. So if we look back into calendar year 2016 and 2017, we have a new mayor, a new city manager, and a new budget director come on board within about 6 months of each other. So lots of change, lots of turnover in the leadership of the city and in the budget office. We also brought on board 4 new budget analysts, 5 new budget analysts within a 5-month period or 3-month period in 2017. So lots of change in the budget office, lots of change in the city. And we also looked at our budget reality and we realized that we're in an environment that a lot of you guys were probably in, which is, our revenue growth wasn't keeping up with our expenditure growth just to maintain the status quo. So every year, in the recent past, we've been in a situation where it costs more money. It costs more than we have in revenue to provide the same level of service that we provided in years past. And as if you're budget people, and I assume you are if you're on this presentation, you know there's only a couple of ways to fix that: raise revenue, decrease services, become more efficient. And we've been in this situation for so many years that becoming more efficient, we've kind of grabbed all the low-hanging fruit. It's difficult, and then ultimately grow the economy. So we were really in a situation where we were at a perfect nexus between opportunity and a mandatory situation where we had to make some changes in the way we did things. And one of the ways we wanted to make sure we communicated, one of the things that we wanted to change is we wanted to make sure we did a better job communicating with the community about our reality. When we opened budget development last year, we had a budget gap of over $13 million, and we really wanted to explain to folks what the situation was, what our reality is, what are some of the difficult decisions that we're wrestling with. So Megan, who came on board last year and at the end of May, was kind of tasked with being the city's budget public outreach czar, or czarina in this case, I guess. And you see on the slide why public engagement, and there's lots of good textbook definitions on the slide, but at the end of the day, we needed to kind of wake up the residents of Norfolk and make sure that we took every opportunity we possibly could to make sure that they understood exactly where we stand, because our city manager and our city council were contemplating a tax increase that, if we didn't get out in front of, was going to cause a lot of consternation. So again, let's start with kind of the step one of budget outreach for the city of Norfolk, and that was kind of defaulting back to a tried and true method of budget engagement, which were public meetings between budget staff and city staff and the general public, and budget staff and city staff and our employees. This is something we had done over the course of a number of years with a modicum of success, always more successful internally with our city employees than it was externally with the public. But we opened up we had a number of engagement sessions, I think 4 in all, 2 with the public and 2 with our employees, where we kind of laid out our reality with respect to the gap. But what we found is over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, doing these in-person budget engagement activities, we just were not garnering much attendance or interest at all. And this year, we found that the vast majority of the folks that were showing up, and it was very few in the public, were kind of either the council frequent flyers that you'll see everywhere, or folks that realized there was a free meal. And at the end of the day, we just weren't getting the type of feedback that we felt was valuable, especially based on staff time, because we had a lot of staff time in this. So this is kind of an outline of some of the questions that we would ask the residents or employees at these outreach events. You have cost saving strategies, you have revenue strategies. We'd set in front of them the budget gap, and we told them they'd have to solve for it. And ultimately, again, it took a lot of staff time, very poor attendance. So after a couple of these, we realized that we needed to figure out a new, much more effective way to communicate our reality to residents. And we set Megan upon the task of figuring out what that might look like. And she's going to kind of walk you through what we did from that point going forward, which I think really revolutionized the way we look at resident engagement around budget.
Yeah, so like Greg was saying, it was a lot of staff time. We had done this in the past, but every year is different with the number of choices that we give residents and the cost estimates, and all of that has to be redone every year, the way that we had been doing our public engagement events. So as you see, there were a lot of staff members and a lot of events, so a lot of really staff hours for not as many participants. So it was a heavy lift on our part, and we felt that we really needed to do something different to be able to reach the people that we were trying to reach, or at least more people, without putting in so much effort and really dollars into what should be fairly or could be more efficient. So we began using Balancing Act in December of last year. And we started out by presenting the deficit. So at the end of the public meetings that we held, once we had gone live, we would encourage people to also go online and use Balancing Act to submit their preferences. So I'm sure some of you are already familiar with Balancing Act, but if you're not, basically it's a tool where residents can go in and increase or decrease areas of the budget on the expenditure side, increase or decrease revenue sources in a way that we have some control over how and what they can change depending on your situation. And so then that data we get and we can submit to our decision makers. So we actually did 3 phases of Balancing Act. So the first one was the preliminary budget gap. So we had the $3.3 million gap, and that was up from the beginning of December through the time that we proposed, which was at the beginning of April. So a good 4 months. It was open for the public to submit, and we did get a lot of submissions, and you'll see that in a few. After that point, we updated it with the proposed budget, and then now we're in the adopted budget phase. And there's different purposes for each of these phases. So during the deficit, we were really asking citizens, what are your preferences for balancing the budget? What areas do you prefer to be cut, or do you prefer us to put more investment into? So this is a screenshot of our proposed budget, and this was really important, the way that we designed this, because we had proposed a 10-cent tax increase. So you'll see that on the left side of the screen, the very first thing, we wanted to make sure it was right in the residents' faces to get their opinion on. What do you think of the 10-cent real estate tax increase? And they could decrease that all the way if they wanted and completely eliminate it. Some people actually increased it. So it was interesting to see people's reactions to the tax increase. And on the right side, on the expenditure side, we broke down very clearly what each cent of that 10-cent tax increase would be dedicated to, and how much revenue that would raise. So not only are we getting an opinion on, would you like, or are you okay with us raising your taxes, but also what do you want that money to go to? And that was really the piece that we wanted to be able to share with decision makers. And what was really interesting is that it came back pretty positive. So we were happy with the way that that went. So I just want to, for those of you who think you might be doing a technology-based budget engagement, give you some ideas for how we approached it. So one of the really important things for us was that we provide context. So a lot of the issues with budget transparency, open budget, open checkbook is that it's a lot of information and not a lot of context, or not a lot of, you're not telling the story to residents of what this really means. Most people aren't going to be able to take the time to really digest and review and analyze the data that's put out. So this is a way to really hone it to what we want them to think about and what we need to know. So for example, we asked about libraries. The city was considering maybe shutting down library branches one day during the week, and these are real options. So we didn't want to give them something just to, you know, so that they could have options, but these were real options that we were considering. The other thing is that we wanted to make sure it was relatable. So one example of this, just quickly, is if we raise the meal tax, what does that really mean for residents? So there's these little info boxes in Balancing Act where you can provide additional context. So in this case, increasing the food and beverage tax by 0.5% meant on a $25 restaurant bill, it's a 12-cent increase in your bill. And then finally, the most important part was that we really use the data, digest it, and share it with decision makers and the public. So of course they're going to want to know what other people thought. So it took a while for us to figure out how exactly we would promote or synthesize the information and give it to decision makers like our council and city manager, because there are very extreme polarizations in feedback. So we had one person who completely eliminated all taxes. So that is obviously going to skew the data. So we just split it into whether they raised, lowered, or did not make any changes to each specific category, and felt that that gave a good sense of generally where people were falling in their preferences. I just noted that it's important to add a disclaimer if you're going to do something like this. We were wanting to be very careful that we weren't misrepresenting people, and so we just added a disclaimer that says our results, while awesome, aren't representative of all Norfolk residents, but only those who provided inputs. And that was because, actually, part of it was because a neighboring city had a little bit of blowback based on the survey that they did, because their survey was not representative, but the way that they went back and explained the results and used the results made it seem like it was representative. So just be careful of the way that you do that in the public sphere. Like I said, the results of our proposed budget input from Balancing Act was really positive. So even though we were proposing a 10-cent increase and expected a lot of sort of angry people to be reducing the increase, and we actually saw that most of our residents were in favor of the same spending priorities that the city had prioritized. So education, sea level rise, infrastructure, and we saw that in the way that they selected things in Balancing Act itself, as well as in the comments that they could leave at the end of the submission.
So the Wordle you see here is actually a Wordle that was created based on users' feedbacks to a question of what's the most important?
What is the biggest issue that you see the city facing in the next 3 years?
So these are actual resident. The Wordle's actual resident answers. Obviously, the bigger the word, the more people that mentioned it. So it's pretty cool way to see what folks were worried about.
Mm-hmm. And we did get quite a few hits. So like I said, we had 130 people participate in our public engagement that took like 230 staff hours. And with Balancing Act, which really required only my time and a little bit of prep time with some leadership, we got over 1,000 people looking and learning from it.
All right, taxpayer receipts. We also rolled out another product called Taxpayer Receipt, which allows residents to kind of understand how their tax dollars are being spent and on what services. To me, I thought this was super cool. We made sure we only used the local revenue, and we only show the portions of local revenue that were going to each of these areas. But it was really neat to be able to see, of my estimated, $3,000 or $4,000 local tax bill, how much of that was actually going towards each of our different departments or areas. And there's some scary things in there about, like just how much of our money goes to debt service versus, libraries or recreation. But I thought it was Taxpayer Receipt was another really cool solution we could offer our residents. At the end of the day, some of our takeaways, and some of the things that we would encourage you guys to do is our communications department did an excellent job of really getting the word out of all of the things that we were doing. We used Twitter, we used Facebook, we used Nextdoor, we did press releases. I mean, we spent a lot of time and effort making sure that anyone who was interested in what's going on with the budget was getting pinged, was getting information in a number of different ways. We actually got one of the local news stations interested in what we were doing, and they came and we did a little bit of we did a news story on Balancing Act. And what was so cool is, after we did our taping here, they went back and cut together the story. And a big portion of the story on the news was the anchor, the reporter, actually going in and balancing the city of Norfolk's budget on his computer in the news station. So we thought it was a really good way to. It really showed residents, how they could use Balancing Act, how they could get involved. We got some good feedback from the press from that perspective. And really, what I think this did more than anything is we proposed a 10-cent tax increase in our proposed budget. And I got to tell you, we were pretty sure we were going to get some of that to stick. But we had a pool in the budget office about which portions of the tax increase would remain in the adopted budget, and almost nobody thought all of them would. But at the end of the day, I think we got, based on the amount of public engagement that we did, the results from our public engagement, we got council really comfortable with the fact that, at least for those who are interested and those who are willing to come and participate, we did a good job of communicating the why we needed to raise taxes. And as a result, I think they really got, behind what council really got behind what we were doing. We provided them really good cover from that perspective. Whether it's anecdotal or not, when we had our one big budget public hearing that we do, I told all of the analysts, I said, man, you guys better be ready to be here till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We have proposed a 10-cent tax increase. We are going to have a ton of people come out and give their opinions. Literally, we had one person who came and spoke against the tax increase at the budget public hearing. And we'd like to think that the amount of outreach we did really played a part in making that the case. So at the end of the day, the entire tax increase passed, and we got to implement some cool new services that were really important for the residents of Norfolk. Megan, you have anything?
No, I think it was really incredible. The impact on council was huge, and they jumped on board really quickly. So that's probably the biggest question that we get from people who are deciding to implement Balancing Act is, how do you get buy-in? And really, we didn't have as much trouble with getting buy-in as we expected. There are only a couple people on council who are really active on social media, And so we weren't sure how familiar or comfortable they would be with an interactive budget engagement online tool, but it really made a big difference. So that being said, I'll pass it on to Chris.
All right, well, thank you. You guys are truly leaders in this whole area, and thank you for sharing your story. So what I want to talk about now is really we see our role at this point, now that we've got a fairly mature product that's out there and being used by scores of local governments, is to keep up and to try to make additional features that can be useful to people like Greg and Megan or Jeremy Lucas from Milwaukee County, who presented on last month's webinar. And so I just want to show you a couple of these things because I think they're actually kind of cool, and they anticipate some of the needs that Megan and Greg discussed earlier in their presentation. I'm just going to show you a few things. So this is just my sandbox for Balancing Act, and I'm not going to go over everything because you already saw what Megan and Greg have done with their presentation. But I do want to just show you sort of where things are going. So we're seeing a tighter and tighter integration with some of the visualizations that are out there, whether it's for budget or performance. So I just want to show you how that looks. So this is for the police department. If you click on the blue info icon, you see it responsible for enforcing laws and public safety. If you click on more details, you get a little bit of a history of this item. It says over the last 5 years, the overall police department budget has increased an average of 0.7% annually. Response time and other metrics for cities of this side are well within acceptable norms. And then you get a product. This is one of the purpose-built financial visualization programs out there. It's called Open Book. It's a product of Questica, and you can just plop that right into the Balancing Act. This is new as of about 3 months ago, and you can get all sorts of information. If you click it again, it takes you to, we're using the city of Largo, Florida's information here. You get even more information. The next thing that we're working on with this is, I need to close this, is including performance metrics. And so just yesterday, we were working with a company that does performance measurement and strategic planning called Invisio. And we were able to do this in just a few minutes. So this is the fire department. The fire department responds to fire and other public safety calls. If you click on this, you get this performance dashboard for the fire department. And this is just, I think this is really cool. So you get response time performance versus national standards. So you see that in all these weeks that the fire department is well below their target and well below the ICMA national average. And then you can scroll down and get more information about what type of incidents are coming up, et cetera. And really just give people sort of a top line understanding of how their fire department is performing. And then if they were to want to consider just a general increase to the fire department, or if there's one of those scenario questions like Megan was talking about, such as should more be invested in having an even faster response time or something like that, that would have a dollar value attached to it, that can go in here, but you're giving people a top line level of information about performance just embedded, which once again, that's where the value comes from with making this data available, is to put it into the context of asking people to weigh in on the trade-offs and ultimately where to spend dollars. This next thing I wanted to show you is a brand new feature from about a week ago, and it's called dedicated funds. And this would have actually been a useful feature for Norfolk, as you had determined what your 10-cent tax increase would go towards. You could have, if this would have existed, you could have used this to sort of educate people about what that would happen. So this is the Better Road Sales Tax. This is just, once again, fictitious. And it says, should sales tax be increased in order to fund transportation projects? And so if you want to interact with this, we'll just click no just to see what happens. So it asks the question, should sales tax be increased? Say no. And the city sales tax would remain at 2%. And you've got $0 of new funding. And you can click on that. And I just, for the sake of putting something together, there's a sort of a sad-looking pothole with a sad-looking cone in it. But then if you were to say yes, increase taxes to build transportation projects, you find out that the sales tax rate would go up to 2.3%, and then you've got a very dynamic video down here that shows workers fixing potholes. So that's one thing that we're really excited about. And so we just, so now, as you can see, this item, this revenue item, is linked with this spending item. And we think this is going to be a really dynamic way, especially for those jurisdictions that have to get voter approval for a tax increase or even authority for a bond. This is a great way to do that. I wanted to show you also some analytics. Jeremy from Milwaukee County last week showed off some of their things. He sort of did the drill down, but I want to give you the top level. Milwaukee County and Norfolk are two of the leaders in this, and this is the result of their campaign. They spent about 6 weeks going out from about August 1st to about the middle of September. And this is a county, and people, I think, generally have a more diffuse relationship with their county, but they just got remarkable participation. They got 4,700 page views. They had 26 minutes on site. They had 653 people submit. And by the trick here is if you submit, you have to balance the budget. So you have to honor that same constraint that Megan and Greg and Jeremy have to honor. And it's tough, which means you need to make some hard decisions sometimes. What we've done recently is we've come up with a way. We were not happy with the fact that we often would only get information from the people that submitted. And so we actually created a way, which I'll show you in just a second, of capturing information on everyone. So if people don't submit, we actually take a snapshot before they leave of what the actions they've taken, and we display those for our clients as well. And so this just gives some demographics, where people are coming from, age, and you can see it's a really good distribution of age and so forth. This tells you where people are coming from. Once again, a lot of free media. And then this graphic, this is the new one that is really interesting. So Milwaukee County set up their budget so that this is on the spending side, that they started with a $23 million deficit, and so they did not let people increase spending. They only let people decrease. And so this graph shows what people ultimately did. The orange lines show those who submitted, so those who honored the constraint of having a balanced budget. It showed what they cut. And then the teal one is people who clicked. So these are people who ultimately didn't finish the exercise and ultimately didn't have to honor that same constraint of having a balanced budget. Milwaukee County broke theirs into mandated and non-mandated categories. And then they put a constraint on cuts to mandated categories that you couldn't cut more than 2%. So they really tried to put residents in their shoes and say, if we want these things, we need to come up with a solution. And there's only so much we can do on the spending side. On the revenue side, this is where you get some really nice willingness to pay. You've got various types of revenue sources: property tax, vehicle registration fee, et cetera. And once again, you can see the trend line here. They did not let people lower taxes because they are in a severe deficit right now. But they were testing people's willingness to pay, where they wanted to pay more property tax, and to a certain degree they were. The one that they really learned about that is being fed into the budget process and even the political ratification process is that there seems to be a fair amount of interest, and not that people love this, but there's a fair amount of interest in increasing the vehicle registration fee. And here are some other items as well. So anyway, there's a lot of information. We collect an enormous amount of information on users, and we're getting better and better at displaying it in ways that our local government clients can then share with others. I want to do a couple more things. I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip. This is a new version we're really excited about. We're releasing it with University of Colorado School of Public Affairs, and it's an election edition. The Balancing Act, Megan was talking about how they did 3 iterations at different points in the budget process. Balancing Act is really easy to make iterations and use it at different times. So we made this one just for the 4 weeks between now and the election, or 3 weeks between now and the election. And down here, Coloradans are going to have 3 huge budget items to look at, to decide on as residents. They're going to have some transportation ballot questions and some education ballot questions. And so this is designed to, as a public education exercise, using information from the state's Blue Book. So it's deductive data from the state legislative analysts that's helping them think about, well, what about Prop 109? It would authorize bonds for highway projects. And so the default is no, to keep the status quo. But then if you say yes, it opens up that same window that gives you a chance to say, well, Prop 109 would direct the state to borrow $3.5 billion and fund 66 highway projects. And so you can get more information here, and you can get a link, I think, somewhere, I'm not sure exactly, I think it's down here, to the projects that it would build. So, and But the problem here is that even though it directs the state to borrow some money, it doesn't come with a new revenue source. So it actually costs the state $260 million a year to pay off the bonds over 20 years. And so that's a little bit of an issue. If you were to say no, you would keep the status quo, but they're trying to let people know that there is some serious deficiencies in the transportation system. The effective spending power is lower now than it was in 1991. It talks about Colorado's gas tax burden, and then down here it sort of shares the status quo of how transportation dollars are spent. And so then if you say no to that, all right, well, let's go ahead and say yes. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and say yes, and then I'm going to continue. It takes you over to the spending side, and you can see that you've just added $260 million of new spending without any new revenue, and so you're now in deficit. And so this is another good way of getting that willingness to pay. To ask residents to say, okay, you said you wanted this new spending on roads, but you didn't authorize any new revenue source for it. So what did you want to cut? And so this is we hope this will be a very good educational tool. And there's two other amendments or propositions and amendments as well. This is bonding with a new sales tax, and then down here is some new education spending that would be a graduated income tax. So we're expecting this to get an awful lot of usage. The last thing I wanted to talk about is before we were makers of software, we were a face-to-face public policy consulting company. We very much believe in face-to-face interaction. And so we have designed a way to use Balancing Act as a facilitation tool, so in live face-to-face interactions. And we found this to be just enormously helpful. This is a picture of an all-hands meeting for a large health center. It's a $50 million low-income health center, and their CEO wanted to get broad engagement and broad input from the entire staff, from 400 people at one time, on some proposed increases in spending that the CEO wanted to make, and some proposed ways of paying for it. And both of them, he could have made them certainly as the CEO and the leader of the organization, but he wanted the entire staff to have an opportunity to provide their input, maybe some new ideas, but most of all, he wanted them to own them, because some of the things that they wanted to do would require sort of a change in attitude from staff. They would have to sort of own this idea, like, the major revenue generator is to make sure that people show up for their appointments, because a missed appointment is a missed revenue opportunity. And so he wanted them to, in his words, he wanted the whole staff to own the mission. I think this is very transferable to a public sector situation where you're asking city staff, how we've got these tax dollars, how do we spend them in the way that is based on priorities and is the wisest and best way on behalf of our residents. So I just sort of love this photo. This is another picture. This is just at the table. They used a situation where they had a table facilitator, and then they would use our meeting mode, and then they would get to see the results. After they went through it, they would get to see the results projected in real time, and then they could have a conversation about it. And then this last one, this is from City of Kansas City, and I show this slide a lot, but I just really like it. This is they won an award from GFOA in May for their community engagement process and their budgeting process, and part of it was them using going to these meetings and providing people an opportunity to interact with the simulation. And I very much understand that public officials may be a little reluctant to ask residents what they think, to sort of expose them to actual budget decisions and actual numbers. But I have not seen a situation where, when you give people a good opportunity to have a conversation, you give them good information and a good way to provide input, that it's led to bad effects. I mean, what I found is, what Greg and Megan found, they talked about the budget meeting changing. They were expecting that their analysts would have to be there till 2 a.m. And instead, one person had a complaint, but I bet they had a lot of better questions than they'd seen otherwise. And so this quote I'll just end on comes from Adam Blom from Kansas City. And he says, "The amazing thing is that residents are almost silent as they go through the exercise because they're concentrating so hard on making these decisions." So this is something that we very much believe is sort of a good next step in local government and democracy, and we're really happy to partner with other organizations that are moving in this direction as well. And Ryan, I'm done.
Great, thank you, Chris, Megan, and Greg. So from here, I'm going to grab the screen on back, and we are going to dive into about a 10-minute, little 8 to 10 minute Q&A. As noted in the very beginning, if you do have comments, questions, concerns, feedback, you can still submit that now through the questions section. But if we do run out of time here, don't fret. We'll get to those. We'll send those off after the session and then provide you feedback via email. So from there, let's dive on in. Okay, so one question that we did get in, and Chris, maybe you're best to dive into this one. You know, with the Balancing Act platform, are users able to see how, well, users, but citizens engage in this process? Would they be able to see how other communities budgeted? No. Oh, Chris, it sounds like you might be muted.
There we are. Sorry. In theory, yes, you could do that. But even the title of this webinar was about the specific needs of specific local communities. You could certainly do that and show some comps. So there's no reason why you couldn't. I guess I would wonder about how useful it would be, but there's no technical reason why you couldn't.
Sure. Got it. Well, all right. Well, so let's dive into a few others here while we still have time. All right. So Megan or Greg, if either of you could dive into this one. Did you all include the capital budget information, or had you thought about it in your process?
We didn't this year. We wanted to lay a baseline down to kind of get the conversation started. Sometimes when you mix the capital budget with the operating budget, it can be really confusing, and folks conflate the two very easily. I think ultimately, you know, the goal is continuous improvement, right? So to figure out how to find a way to make sure that we provide our residents and users of the products that we put out the widest range of information we possibly can, but we weren't able to work it in last year.
Got it. Thanks. All right, and let's dive into, let's see, one last question here, and then we'll wrap things up. But again, if you had any other questions, please submit those to the post-session survey, and we'll pass these on to our panelists here today. All right, so last question, and again, Megan and Greg, if you all could be so kind as to provide a response. How did you all get, or could you speak to how you got buy-in from your city's leadership when you decided to switch to the platform, and perhaps the process that led to getting that buy-in?
Yeah, so our process was basically when I came on and we decided that we were going to go a different direction, researched a lot of best practices in budgeting and public engagement, created a presentation specifically for our city manager outlining some of the best practices, the options that cities have, and then ultimately our recommendation. And so giving him a menu of options, letting him think through each of the costs and benefits of each of the options, and then looking at our recommendation, I think that helped to show that it was a very thoughtful process. And then in terms of getting buy-in from council, that was a little bit easier because it's usually the city manager is going this direction. This is what we're doing, and it's more of an informative thing. The buy-in piece for council was, we need you as council members to try to get your constituents to participate. So I think I mentioned there were only really a couple of people who use social media a lot, but they did like retweet and repost Facebook posts that the city page posted, and so that helped, I think, boost participation. And even during council meetings, they really highlighted their appreciation for the option for their constituents. So it went pretty smoothly for us.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, hey, I don't mean to bring this on all of you, but well, maybe I do. Any last comments before we round things out here today? Chris, let's start with you. Any last comments on your part?
Well, one last idea. So also in terms of things that we have in the works, we've been working with 3 university-based researchers who have helped us to develop what we call a research mode for Balancing Act, and we've done some testing now with representative sample, and the results have been remarkable. And they're actually doing some research and scholarship and writing about Balancing Act not just being a public engagement tool, but also being a research tool that can actually give you socially scientific representative feedback on the budget in a way that is sort of better, faster, cheaper than budget surveys. So I think in the next couple of years or so, we're going to get more and more local governments that are using Balancing Act with a representative sample and getting much richer data in terms of willingness to pay and sincere preferences. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to.
Great. Thanks, Chris. All right, and Megan and Greg, any last comments on your end?
Nothing from us.
Yeah, thanks to the Alliance and Chris for putting this together. We're happy to have been able to participate. And, if you're out there thinking about getting started with budget engagement, just do something, right? And then get better every year. Perfect end.
Yeah.
All right, folks. So from there, we're going to wrap things up on a quick few last slides. So I just want to mention that the handout was sent out right before today's session, but if you would like for another copy, feel free to reach out to me, Ryan Spillers, at rspillers@transform.gov. I'd be happy to send you another copy, as well as answer any questions you have about today's session or any other items with our learning program. Also want to make mention to save the date for some other upcoming sessions. And then finally, I would like to thank you all for joining the call and being on today's session. I think the presentations were fantastic and covered some really great content, and I just want to have a huge thank you to Chris, Megan, and Greg for providing those presentations. Also, I did want to make mention that we do have a post-session survey, so if you do get a chance to answer those questions, that will help us improve the learning event after this one and those after that. So please do that, and again, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, folks.
All right, thank you.